Well, there were a couple of terrific passages today of celebration and incredible joy. But today I'm going to talk about Michal. Mainly because it's putting my money where my mouth is. I've often said to students, so have you ever heard any sermons on people like Michal? So I thought I should probably go there since she shows up in the text. The late Jewish scholar Tikva Freemer-Kensky observed in her book, Reading the Women of the Bible, that if someone came from Mars and they were strangely able to read the Hebrew Bible, that they would think that women were incredibly powerful and important in the ancient Near East. I mean, obviously, most women and men in any era of history are forgotten. They're anonymous. Their lives and their exploits are not recorded. But the women who are remembered in the Old Testament are courageous and inventive and persistent, despite living in societies dominated by men. And one of these women, of course, is Michal, who shows up in 2 Samuel 6 that we read today. And we see her in this passage at a low point in her life. Everybody else is rejoicing, and she's not. And I think that's something that all of us can relate to somewhat, right? There are those times when everybody is fantastically joyful and your heart is a stone. But we need a little background, or we're liable to read Michal's story in 2 Samuel 6 as a carping or jealous wife, a stereotype that has been foisted on her by many people through the years. And I don't mean to exonerate Michal, but perhaps to understand her and to see that, like so many of us, she was a mixture of the admirable and the miserable, the successful and the beaten down. Due to forces beyond her control, her life took a number of difficult turns. That's the human condition. So what do we know about Michal? I would say there are 5 acts in her life. Act 1, Michal in love. In 1 Samuel 18, we meet Michal when her father, King Saul, is told by his advisors that Michal loves this young warrior that Saul has brought into his household. This, interestingly enough, is the only time in the Bible that we hear explicitly about a woman loving a man. So that's an important detail that the narrator has given us. As many of you know, Saul had invited David into his household to play the harp, to soothe his bitter moods. And then David turns up to fight the Philistine warrior Goliath. And David's victory and all the adulation that comes with it gets on Saul's nerves. He becomes insanely jealous and starts his episodic practice of throwing spears at his musician. So when Saul hears that his second daughter, Michal, is in love with this hero, what does he do? He doesn't say, "Oh, that's great, let's have a party, I just want to make my daughter happy." Instead, he takes advantage of her affection by pretending to agree to the marriage while actually conspiring to have David killed. And to do so, he sets a very strange bride price. We'll just say David is supposed to kill 100 Philistines, which probably to Saul felt like a fail-safe plan, because this is the same group of people that David had killed their greatest warrior, and they probably had a particular vendetta against David. So Michal may have been smart enough to see that rather than giving her what she asked for, David as spouse, her father was trying to get her beloved killed. Now, what did David think? We're never told. We don't know what he thought about Michal. The marriage may have simply been politically expedient, like many marriages of kings and people who are soon to be kings. All we know for sure is that David was reluctant to become the son-in-law of Saul until There was a bride price he could pay. He doesn't have money. He's not wealthy. He can't pay the king the bride price. But when it comes to violence, now that's something he can do. And he takes up the challenge and he kills twice as many Philistines as Saul has required. He's called King Saul's bluff. So ultimately, Michal gets to marry the man she loved, but in this first act, her father tries to kill her betrothed, and her husband seems to be consumed with impressing her father with violence. A less than ideal way to start a marriage all around. In this messy world, sometimes just getting what we want turns out to be mixed with things that diminish the gift. That's the beginning of Michal's story. Act 2, Michal to the rescue. So pretty soon, Saul is after David's life again, which leads in 1 Samuel 19 to Jonathan saving David's life, Michal saving David's life, and finally David finding refuge with the prophet Samuel, who protects him with God's Spirit. But this is the chapter where we see Michal's feisty involvement in David's story. 1 Samuel 19:11 says, Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. So what we see in Michal here is that she's strong, and she actively protects David. She takes the side of her husband, her new husband, over and against her father, who is the king and who is a notably violent man. She aligns herself with the house of David as the power struggle between the house of David and the house of Saul is heating up. The text continues, then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, he is ill. She not only helped him get away, but she endangered herself further to protect him more. It's a little funny that the guards leave him alone because she says he's ill when Saul wants to kill him. Who cares if he's sick? He's going to die. But maybe they are afraid of Michal. Maybe she pulls the royal card. Get out of my house. They don't know what to do, so they go back to the king. And the text continues, then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, bring him up to me in his bed so that I might kill him. Which is a strange thing to say, but you can kind of hear Saul's exasperation. I told you to bring me to him, and I don't care if you have to bring me the guy in his bed. Just get him here. But of course, when they return, they discover that there was an idol in the bed, and what they thought was a lock of his hair sticking out from underneath the covers turns out to be goat's hair. She's done something completely incriminating out of her desire to give David a chance to get further away. What did she think? Did she think her father would kill her? Was she so young and in love that she didn't care? Did David worry about her safety? Or only his own? We don't know. Finally, Saul said to Michal, why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped? Saul doesn't say, your husband, the man you love, my son-in-law. He says, my enemy. It never seemed to occur to him that she would protect the man she loves, or that she would have no loyalty to a father who tried to kill her betrothed. So she concocts a story that David threatened her. She has risked her life for David by convincing him to run. She's helped him out the window. And then particularly with this ruse about the idol in the bed. And just a sidebar, she does lie to her dad. But she joins a long list of people in the Old Testament texts who use their wits, powerless people, who use their wits to outsmart the powerful. The issue here isn't that she lied, but that she, a mere woman and a daughter, defied the king and shamed her own father. The narrator commends her for this. She's chosen the right even though it was dangerous and perhaps personally complicated. In this act, Michal is a model for us all. However, her standing in the text sinks from here. Michal's allegiance are clear and unequivocal, and the reader is now waiting for the young couple's next move and their eventual reunion, says an Old Testament scholar. But this reunion never comes. In the next chapter, David comes back, but we only hear that he visits Jonathan. He either didn't care enough about her to see her, or no one thought it was important enough to the storyline to record it if he did. Act 3. Michal is married off by her father to someone else. Finally, David flees for good. Many of you know the story, kicking off a number of years of being a fugitive, running for his life. And I think initially, this had to be horrible for Michal. Think about your loved one. You don't know if the person's alive. The person is being hunted by your very own father. And then to complicate things, Paul marries her off. Maybe he did it out of spitefulness toward her. Why do Michal and Jonathan love David so much? Or maybe he was using his daughter to lash out at David. He shames David by giving his wife to someone else and takes away his status as a member of Saul's household. On the other hand, the narrator gives us this little detail, that Saul gives Michal to a man named Paltiel right after the narrator has told us the story of Abigail and the women that David is now bringing into his household. I want to pause right here to observe that there's a tendency in the history of interpreting the Bible to read women's stories more negatively than the narrator intends us to. This is a case in point. Some commentators literally blame Michal for failing to love David adequately. Oh, look, her ardor waned. Now she's married to some other guy. When the narrator has gone to great lengths to show that she pretty much is just being used as a pawn by the powerful men in her life. No, this new marriage is not Michal's idea or her fault. Rather, something that is done to her for her father's agenda, an injustice. Blaming the victim, how we read the Bible sometimes, and how we read the sorrows in other people's lives sometimes, not particularly loving. Act 4, Michal is dragged out of her second marriage. So David, by this point, has been king over Judah and is on the cusp of becoming king over all the tribes. 10 or 11 years have elapsed since he married Michal. So all this time, Michal has been in someone else's household. She's been living with Paltiel, her second husband. The late King Saul's general, Abner, decides to switch sides. It's all intrigue. You can read this throughout the whole first set of chapters in the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of 2 Samuel. Abner decides to align himself with the house of David and volunteers to bring all Israel with him. This is what David wants. He wants to be king over all. And he says, that's great. One condition. Bring me Michal. And the reason he gives? Bring me Michal because I paid a bride price for her. This is not exactly the sentiment of somebody who cherishes her and misses her, but someone who is retrieving something he owns. She had aligned herself with the house of David, but here she's being traded as a symbol of the surrender of the house of Saul to David. So imagine it. The king's guards show up at your door and tear you from your husband of 10 years. He can do it because he's the king and he has his reasons. shaming and subduing the house of Saul, ensuring that no children are born to Saul's line, etc. But here's the rub. Paltiel, her second husband, loves her. Paltiel so desperately wants Michal to stay in his family that when the king's guards take her and they're marching, they're going by foot to where David is, the city of David, Paltiel follows the procession weeping. He's weeping publicly enough that people notice and it gets recorded. This is the only time in Michal's entire story when someone expresses love for her. David, for his part, by this point, has at least half a dozen wives, full wives, as well as some concubines, which of course was culturally acceptable in that era. In fact, was expected of a man of his wealth and his power. But that doesn't mean that it was easy on the women who were involved. In fact, all of the stories of polygamy in the Old Testament depict women's pain. Polygamy, the subtext seems to be, never does result in the flourishing of all the people involved, premised as it is on male privilege, which is to say, injustice. So was David right here to force Michal back to his house? Some people argue it was politically necessary, but others, like the scholar John Kessler, observe that the narrator gives us clues that he disapproves of David's actions here. First, he juxtaposes David's claim that Michal is his wife with the observation that she's being taken away from Paltiel, who is her husband. And also, before describing David's desire to get her back, the narrator has given us the names of all the sons born to all these various wives. The narrator seems to be saying, David already has enough sons and enough wives. He doesn't really need to disturb Michal. We don't have to think everything David did was wonderful just because it's David. So the final act. Michal protests David's dancing. It's a second window scene. She looks out of the window and despises David's dancing. Maybe this time she's trying to protect his honor. He's a little bit crazy. It is about the dancing, but maybe her despising him is about the whole way that things went down and her status as captive wife. She freely chose David in the first place because she loved him, but she winds up a pawn, first of her father and then of the man she loved. And more than that, she defended him with her life, but he doesn't seem to go out of his way to make her happy and ultimately tears her from a loving home. And then there's the nakedness that comes up in the passage that after the passage we read, which perhaps she rightfully critiqued. Just because you're God's anointed doesn't mean you get to do anything you want, right? Flashing the crowd may not be a great thing to do. It may not be a sign of faithful worship, but a sign of recklessness. And her bitterness is not great either, particularly in the context of overflowing worship of Yahweh. But the narrator has described two real people here, weaknesses and all. So just a couple observations to close us out here. Observation 1, David is not a spotless hero, and therefore we don't have to see Michal as his opposite, a hopeless crank. They're both real humans with messiness and imperfections, as well as longings. Maybe we need to remember that David, though he was a person after God's own heart, and though God employed his talents in a whole range of ways, was not perfect. And I'm not trying to diminish David, but we have to get out of the habit of automatically granting the powerful man the benefit of the doubt. We shouldn't do it with biblical characters, and we certainly shouldn't do it with the rich and famous men in our era, in politics, in show business, in sports, or in the church. And it's not as if the Bathsheba fiasco was David's only failing. David, like us, was imperfect all the way along, which is actually good news, isn't it? That God doesn't wait until we're holy at some stratospheric level before welcoming our contributions. Observation number 2. If injustice is the mistreatment of people who are created by God, who are delighted in by God, who are beloved of God, what is the proper response? And what if this person, beloved of God but mistreated by others, is one's own self? Is it okay to be angry? It looks like the psalmist thought so. Let my enemies fall into the pit they made. Right? There's a sense in which the imprecatory psalms, the psalms that call on God to harm the enemy, are an expression of the anger that's appropriate to being treated unjustly. But we made anger the biggest sin in some ways. In the church, but also in our culture. The rich often cannot understand the frustration or even the anger of those who work 3 jobs and still can't make rent and buy food. White native-born Americans are often uncomfortable when people of color or immigrants express anger at being treated as second class in a million different ways. Men sometimes can't stand it when women express anger at their treatment, most recently in the Me Too movement, or the church version, Church Too. Sick of not being taken seriously, outraged at not getting justice. It's too easy for the comfortable to dismiss a cry for change if it, quote, sounds angry. And the call to civility is often a hidden drive to silence anger, which is to say, shut down the calls to end injustice. Observation 3. The story of Michal is a tale of warning that our lives have an impact, that how we treat people matters. She didn't suddenly become a bitter person, but that whole series of betrayals changed her. She's an example of what happens when a human being is used as a means to an end, in her case, by the 2 men who should have loved her the most. Frederick Buechner has observed that the degree to which we fail to love makes others' lives that much less worth living. What if we remember that each person we meet is so beloved of God that Jesus came on their behalf? And of course, our failures can do more than embitter people against us, but can impede the worship of God. Michal could not join the festivities, though Yahweh was her God as well. This was a celebration of God's victory and God's presence with the people, but she was a broken person. I hope there was another chapter in her story, one with some sort of restoration and comfort, though obviously we don't know. May her story be for us a challenge to live courageously and choose the right. May it be a reminder to show grace to those suffering injustice, even if they're angry, to hear their stories. May it be a warning to us about how our brokenness harms the people around us if we aren't allowing the love of God to suffuse our relationships and all our interactions. Amen.